Hello and welcome to the Ramblings of a 42-year-old man. Chris Smith here, and we are going to continue on with our Final Fantasy VIII coverage. We left off kind of finishing up our first mission, which didn't quite go how we wanted it to, and then we had some weirdness with Cypher and the Sorceress, and now we're going to go look and see what our next set of orders are. We're on the way to Galbadia Garden, and we will pick up right there with trying to see what we're going to go on to next with this game. Thank you. So when we get to Galbadia Garden, we receive our next mission. That is to assassinate the Sorceress Edea. We are also given a new team member. This is when we meet Irvin, because he's a sharpshooter. He's a rifle guy. He's he's kind of a sniper. He's going to be our sniper to assassinate the Sorceress. And so we head to the capital city of Delling City, which is where this assassination is supposed to take place. We get all situated and prepared, and things kind of go south a little bit. We end up running up to this float where Edea has been kind of coming through the city and announcing herself. And we fight with her. We fight with Cypher, who's actually, they're protecting her now for some reason. He's calling himself the Sorceress Knight. And as we get to that fight, Squall is badly injured, and we all end up getting arrested. So we come back to the game with the team having been arrested. They're all in prison. Cypher is kind of torturing Squall, trying to get information out of him about what a CD's role is, because, since Cypher had kind of gone off mission back with that CD test, he never got to officially become a CD. And him and the Sorceress both think that CDs, there's some sort of special meaning behind them, and they want to know what it is, so they're kind of trying to torture that information out of Squall. Squall has no idea what the heck they're talking about. He's like, we're just mercenaries that do jobs, and I don't know what you're talking about. But luckily, with some help from some creatures in the prison who are kind of mistreated by the guards, they help us to escape. So our whole team, along with Squall, are able to get out of the prison. Unfortunately, we hear that there is going to be a missile attack on both Balam Garden and Trebia Garden because of this attack that happened on the Sorceress. They're kind of retaliating. And so at this point, we're going to split our team up into two and go on a couple different missions here with our split-up team. So our first split-up team, since Selphie is from Trebia Garden, and Trebia Garden is too far to try to get to warn them that these missiles are coming, she takes a couple of our people and goes off to the missile base to try to stop those missiles from coming. Now Squall is going to take a team to Balam Garden, which is closer, to warn them, tell them everything that's happened since they left Balam Garden on their mission, and see what they can do about either evacuating or whatever in case that plan at the missile base does not work out. So we end up going with the missile base team first. They go in, they mess with some of the guidance systems of the missiles a little bit. Unfortunately, they are still able to get launched. The ones to Trebia actually get launched before we're able to do any messing around with them, and we are able to do some for the ones that get sent to Balam at least. So then, whether you consider that a success or not with the missile-based attack, that's how that goes. Meanwhile, Squall's team gets to Balam, and there's some sort of civil war going on in the school between the headmaster's people and the garden master's people. We never even heard of who this garden master is, but pretty much the facility, the people who work for the garden, other than the teachers and the headmaster themselves, are kind of on one side, and the headmaster and himself and a lot of the students are on the other side. And we have to try to figure out, what the heck is this? Stop doing all this, because we got missiles coming here. What are we going to do? So we're able to kind of get past through all that. We talked to Headmaster Sid, and he tells us that if we go down to the basement, he thinks there's some way of us being able to protect the garden down there. We get down there and we find out that we can turn the garden into a movable building. And so we do so, and we kind of get moving just in time for these missiles to come down and miss us. There's been enough of a mess from the missile-based team, so they're not directly able to hit right where the garden's at. They end up missing the garden as we're moving it out of the way as well. Unfortunately, we can't really control this new floating garden, and we end up crashing into a place called Fisherman's Horizon. Luckily enough, that is also where the missile-based team ends up at, and we're able to kind of get our team all back together again. So at this point, Selphie really wants to go to Trebia to see if anybody was able to make it out after the missiles came, and we get to Trebia, and it has been hit bad. It is in kind of in shambles, but there are survivors. So we go in, we talk to a few people. We end up having kind of a meeting at this basketball court in the back, and just talking to each other, we all kind of find out that our entire team, minus Renoa, came from the same orphanage, and most of them have very little memory of this, mostly because they have been told that when you use the GF like they do as these mercenaries, their memories can sometimes get messed up. So nobody really, until they start talking about them, all of a sudden they remember that they all were at this orphanage together, and the person who ran this orphanage was Adia, who is now the sorceress. And they're like, what the heck? What is going on here? How are we all from this orphanage? Was she our caregiver, and why is she a sorceress now? So we plan to head over to that orphanage to talk to her, and on the way we run into Galbadia Garden, which is now being run by Sorceress Adia and Cypher, and we get into a big battle between Galbadia Garden and Balam Garden. So we end up having to infiltrate Galbadia Garden, going through and fighting battles and stuff until we get to the middle of it, where we find Cypher, and then we find Adia. We end up fighting and defeating them both. After we defeat Adia, we see kind of this cutscene of kind of this almost ghostly presence coming out of Adia, and then it goes into Rinoa somehow, and then Rinoa passes out and is now unconscious. And so we end up having kind of purged Adia from some sort of evil, but now it is affecting Rinoa in some way. So we head to the orphanage where Adia is now at, and we talk to her, and we find out that certain people are born with the power of a sorceress. Those powers are kind of dormant in them unless they are kind of passed along through other sorceresses. And what's happened, sometime in the past, Adia had been approached by the dying spirit of a sorceress, and her powers were kind of passed on to her. But rather than just the way that it's supposed to go, it's supposed to be kind of a peaceful transition of powers, this sorceress sort of like possessed Adia, and that's how she ended up becoming a bad sorceress. So we're worried now that is happening to Rinoa. That Rinoa may have been born with these dormant sorceress powers, and now this same sorceress, whose name is Ultimisia, may be trying to do the same thing to her. While this is all happening, Squall's kind of realizing that, throughout all the adventures and stuff they've had, Rinoa's kind of carefree attitude has kind of broken down his barriers a little bit. And the love story kind of begins. He realizes now how much he's begin to feel for Rinoa now that she's unconscious and he can't talk to her and everything like that. So we decide we're going to head to Esther, because we've heard that there used to be a sorceress in Esther and they were able to defeat her. And so maybe they can help us with purging Rinoa of this evil sorceress spirit that we had that is supposedly in her right now as well. So we get to Esther, and the government people send us up to a kind of a space station up in the air where this character is at. I think I've skipped some of this portion of the game. There's a character that was kind of our big sister when we were at the orphanage. Her name was Eloni, and she left the orphanage at some point, and we actually find out in our flashbacks with Laguna that he cared for Eloni at some point as well. She was a little girl in one of his flashbacks, and we have found out that somehow Eloni has powers where she can send people's minds to other people in the past, which is why we're seeing all of these flashbacks with Laguna. And the reason why she's having us do this, we're going to find out, is because her mother, who's a character named Rain, and Laguna were in love, but Laguna went off on this mission, and when he got back, Rain had died and Eloni had been taken away. We'll see a whole flashback of how all of that works as well, where he has to kind of fight through the city of Esther to rescue Eloni, which is around the time that sorceress is there, and it ends up getting overthrown. We'll find out in the future how that all went down as well. But we get up this moon base, and Eloni is up there, and her powers are also kind of sorceress-like as well. So we're kind of hoping maybe she can help us with getting whatever's going on with Rinoa cleared out. Unfortunately, while we're up there, the sorceress that they defeated, the way that they defeated, I'm sorry, this gets very complicated, all this plot that I'm throwing out, but the sorceress that the city of Esther defeated back in the past, they defeated by pretty much jailing her out in space. She's in this kind of space prison. So unfortunately, we're up there with Rinoa being kind of possessed by the sorceress, although she's been kind of unconscious and not showing like anything. All of a sudden, she wakes up and goes and frees this other evil sorceress from Esther. In doing so, the spirit that is kind of possessed Rinoa comes out, and Rinoa is left floating off into space. Luckily, she's in a spacesuit, but she's just floating out into space, and Squall has to kind of jump out in a spacesuit after her to try to rescue her. Again, the feelings that he's had for her, he's willing to risk his life to go do so. Luckily, when he's able to reach her, they find a abandoned airship out in space. It's called the Ragnarok. It's really cool, like dark red dragon shaped space / airship. That's really cool. They're able to get in, kind of get the systems working, and get it landed. Unfortunately, when they land, the people at Esther kind of want to imprison Renoa, obviously, for the things that have happened, but Squall's able to kind of break her free and say, you know, nobody's messing with you as long as I'm around, and we're going to figure this out another way. And we'll get into some of the in-game specifics of how we're going to figure out all this complicated stuff that's going on. All right, so if I haven't already busted your brain, I'll say I've played this game multiple times and I still get very, very confused by the plot. We find that the president of Esther is none other than Laguna. So in the past, when he went to free Eleni from Esther, he actually became part of the resistance movement, and he's part of the crew that overthrew the sorceress and got her, put up in prison in space, and he's now the president there. So being that he is kind of the adopted father of Eleni, and there's also some very hinted at backstory that he's possibly Squall's father as well. I'm not even going to get into that because none of that is very specifically stated, but there's definitely some inferences about that throughout the game. But having this feeling, he kind of works with Eleni to come up with this plan to hopefully get all of these sorcerers is kind of like in one place where they can all kind of get Ultimecia kind of separated and be able to defeat her. And it's through something called time compression, which is what Ultimecia wants. She wants to take all of time and make it into like this one like jumbled up thing of time that she can rule. Well, we figure if we can kind of get that process started and then take her out, we can get the world back to normal, and then Ultimecia will be defeated. And so using Eleni's gifts of sending people back in the past, we're able to kind of help create this time compression world. We have to do it through a place called Lunatic Pandora, which is where that evil sorceress that was imprisoned up in space is now being held after she escaped. So we go into Lunatic Pandora. Guess what? Cypher's there again. We have one last battle with him. We battle this other evil sorceress, Adele. So now we got Renoa there, we got Eleni there, we got Adele there. Ultimecia's presence is possessing presence is in there as well, and we're able to go ahead and get that time compression started with all the sorcerers together. And when we do so, we end up in the time compression world, which is, where all time is happening all at once. And the big main thing of this is Ultimecia's castle is floating right there in the middle of the world, which is our last and final stop in this game. All right, so however complicated all this plot is, however much I don't even know if half of it makes sense, at this point we are at the final dungeon. And I tell you, Ultimecia's castle is one of the coolest final dungeons. You have to kind of split your party into two groups. We've seen this in Final Fantasy VI before. And you kind of have to go back and forth, opening up different paths for your other team. As you go along the way, you need to fight a group of different bosses, because when you first walk in the castle, all of your magic, your GF uses, your junctions, all of the stuff that you've used throughout the game are being locked, and you have to defeat these bosses to unlock all of these skills before you go up and try to fight Ultimecia. I mean, you can try to make a mad dash straight to Ultimecia to do it, but without your magic, without your junctions, without your GFs, you'd have no chance. So you fight through all these different bosses in this castle, and eventually you get up to where you're fighting Ultimecia. You fight her, you defeat her, and as time compression starts to kind of pull apart and get back to normal, you have to be very careful. Like we're telling you, don't get lost in time. Don't get lost in time. Squall, unfortunately, has issues with getting lost in time, and Renoa ends up eventually finding him kind of passed out in this lost time space, and then we cut to black. So we have no idea, does Squall make it back? Did Renoa save him? Or is he okay? Did he get lost in time? Did he die? We have no idea. And we're at credits. Final of the game? Yeah, not quite. During the credits, there is a scene that plays of a celebration at the garden. We see all of our characters. Renoa is kind of out on a balcony area. We kind of see her real quick. We see Irvin and Quistis and Selphie and Zell and the headmaster, and even Edie is there. And, it's kind of a celebration of this defeat of the sorceress. But we don't see Squall. So it's kind of left ambiguous if Squall made it or not. And then By the end of the credits, there's this final little cutscene, and it goes out to Renoa, who's out on that balcony, and kind of in a sister scene to that very first dance scene where Squall meets Renoa. They flip it around, and now we're with Renoa, and we look up, and we see Squall is with her. And for the first time in this 30, 40 hour plus game, we actually see Squall smile. He's finally happy. And that is the end of Final Fantasy VIII. All right, so maybe hard to tell, though this is actually a really fun game. The junction system is severely complicated. The plot is severely complicated, but it is an awful lot of fun to play, especially once you get a handle on the junction system. It is the second best-selling Final Fantasy game of all time. Now, is some of that riding the coattails of Final Fantasy VII? It's possible. This is when Final Fantasy really became a household name, was around this era. But this one was, second best-selling of all time behind 7. It was released to critical acclaim. It was a very acclaimed game. The negative feedback they did have was on the very complicated junction system and the complicated plot, especially in the last third of the game. Just very, very complicated. There's a remastered version released that it kind of upped the graphics. The character models were all improved. A lot of kind of quality of life improvements. You could do like speed ×2 to make the game a little faster. You could, max stat your characters and stuff like that. But again, with this game, you gotta be careful with that because all the enemies will max stat too. So you gotta be careful how that goes. But that was released in 2019. You got Switch port, PS4, Xbox One, and mobile devices all got that remaster. It's definitely the way to play it because similar to the original PlayStation 1 version of Final Fantasy VII, the graphics are definitely dated by this point. But with the remaster, luckily, they're able to make the characters look quite a bit better. So it's kind of our first Final Fantasy where the romance is a central point to it. It's not the last one. Final Fantasy X arguably does it better. I don't even think they arguably does it better. But this was kind of your first time where Final Fantasy started to feel like romance was involved. Final Fantasy IV, Cecil and Rosa were already kind of a couple before that game ever began. So really there was no romance to it. They just were already a couple. Final Fantasy VI, there was a little bit where you could tell Locke and Celes were definitely into each other, but their romance was never really a big point of the game. So this kind of started the romance as a cornerstone of a Final Fantasy game. And you can see that with the marketing, the artwork for the logo even has Squall and Renoa on there. It was definitely a main point of this game. And yeah, so that's Final Fantasy VIII. I enjoy it. It's one of my probably top 5 when it comes to Final Fantasies. The story, like I said, it gets overly complicated, but the junction system, once you get a handle on it, is really fun. You can play around with it a lot. Like I said, you spend a good chunk of the game playing around with that system and let's be honest, playing that triple triad card game. If you're really wanting to maximize the junction skills, you're going to have to play a lot of cards. So hopefully you enjoyed that card game. Otherwise, it would not be a very enjoyable game for you to play. But that's going to get us through Final Fantasy VIII. We will return with our next one. I don't believe we'll do any sort of a side track in between. I don't think there was anything else kind of in between this and 9. 9 came out 1 year after this, so it was very quick. This was 1999. By 2000, we already had Final Fantasy 9 coming out. Now, after kind of the branch offs with Final Fantasy, really 6, 7, and 8 was a little more, like 6 was kind of steampunk, 7 was almost like industrial with this background, 8 was a little more kind of back to sort of a medieval kind of a background. But Final Fantasy IX is a throwback. It's specifically made to be a throwback. It's a medieval setting. It's knights and it's wizards and it's stuff like that. And, it's definitely more geared to a kind of a throwback age. And it's good. It's kind of our last hurrah of the Final Fantasy on PlayStation 1 before we jump into PlayStation 2 and going forward. And so it's a lot of fun. We'll talk about that one next time. And until then, thank you for listening to me ramble, and we will talk again later.